The Tower of Babel is one of the most intriguing and mysterious passages in the Bible. According to the story, a group of people migrated into the land of Shinar and attempted to build a tower to make a name for themselves, until God came down and confused their languages, and then they dispersed from the city. But was this tower actually built, or was it just a myth created by later Jewish authors? When most people hear of the Tower of Babel, they think of this image, some sort of circular tower being constructed in order to reach the clouds, hundreds of meters high. But the truth is, this image came from a 16th century painter from the Netherlands, who had no knowledge of the ancient Near East. So this type of tower probably never existed. The real Tower of Babel was probably something else entirely. Genesis 11 reminds us that this event is happening in the land of Sumer, or as the Hebrews call it, Shinar. In ancient Sumer, cities were built around large religious structures called ziggurats. Ziggurats were sort of large structures with a raised platform and meant to be the highest object in the city. Many scholars believe they were meant to function as a gateway for the gods to come down to earth from the heavens. They probably were not meant for religious ceremonies, which would have been conducted in nearby temples. Instead, they were more about connecting the heavens and the earth via the stairways on the ziggurats. For example, the ziggurat at Babylon was given a title that means the foundations of heaven and earth. The one at Larsa meant temple that links heaven and earth, and the one at Sippor meant stairway to pure heaven. Now in Hebrew, there is no word for ziggurat, nor were there any ziggurats built in Canaan. The word they use for tower is a general word that can really refer to any large structure. So the Hebrew authors are referring to a large structure that a city was built around in the land of Sumer. The obvious and most likely structure in mind is an ancient Sumerian ziggurat. Thus, the Tower of Babel was probably the ziggurat of Babel. Now the next question should be, is when was this tower or ziggurat of Babel built and where? There are some interesting correlations in the text that help us to place the time period for the Tower of Babel and strengthen the reliability of the biblical account. First, it said they made bricks by burning them. In ancient Mesopotamia, fired brick technology was probably developed around the end of the 5th millennium BC. Such bricks did really not exist in Canaan because they did not need them due to the availability of stones and other building materials. In southern Mesopotamia, large stones were not as available, and so out of necessity, fired bricks were developed in order to build temples and other large structures. Thus, the Hebrew authors get the building material correct, even though it was not present in their own region. Second, Genesis 11 records the tower was supposed to have its tops in the heavens. This description matches how Mesopotamian texts speak of ziggurats. John Walton says, throughout Mesopotamian literature, almost every occurrence of the expression describing a building with its head in the heavens refers to a temple with a ziggurat. For example, here's a description by Wared Sin, king of Larsa. He made it as high as a mountain and made its head touch heaven. On account of this deed, the gods Nana and Nagal rejoiced. Third, Genesis 11 says the tower was built after people migrated from the east. Now this could possibly be a reference to the Proto-Sumerians arriving in Mesopotamia. Some scholars think the Sumerians originated in the region, but that is unlikely. Their language is totally unlike the surrounding regional languages. Karen Ray Nimitnijat notes, Sumerian is not related to any language, living or dead. Jean Botero also notes an ancient text called the Myth of the Seven Sages, according to which the southern population, which was still rough-hewn and wild, had been initiated into all that constituted civilized life by strange beings who came by the sea. So it appears the Sumerian culture probably began after a slow migration of new people into the region. Amit-Najat thinks the Sumerian culture appeared in Mesopotamia around the end of the 4th millennium BC, which was also during the Uruk period. George Rowe suggests between 3200 BC and 3500 BC. Some scholars place the arrival of the Sumerians a little further back, but they probably at least arrived sometime after the Ubaid period, and then conquered the region and its inhabitants, bringing with them their unique and obscure language. This probably didn't happen all at once, and was probably a gradual migration, and the people that migrated in mixed with the locals to produce what we now know as ancient Sumer. But it is possible the biblical authors also allude to this migration, saying they came from the east and then took over the region. The urbanization of southern Mesopotamia also seems to have begun around this time. Now the text of Genesis 11 seems to be talking about the beginning of this time period. That is, when people arrived from the east, shortly after the invention of fired bricks, and the beginning of urbanization. So based on the external evidence, Genesis 11 seems to be talking about an event that happened during the 4th millennium BC, and not any later construction of ziggurats or cities. The time period was called the Uruk period, or the Proto-Literate period, as it was the period just before the invention of writing. However, if this is the case, then it creates a problem, as it is often assumed the Tower of Babel refers to the city of Babylon, which wasn't established until the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. But interestingly enough, other ancient texts speak of Babylon existing in ancient times before the 2nd millennium BC. The reason for this is because Babylon and the ancient city of Eridu were often equated. For example, the cities are equated by Berosus when he says the ancient king Alaros reigned in Babylon, whereas the king lists refer to this as Eridu. The toponym for Eridu was also used of Babylon. A.R. George lists several early texts that equate Eridu and Babylon, and indicate the traditions of Eridu seem to have become the traditions of Babylon. In one creation myth, Ea establishes his temple Ezekiel when Eridu was built, but then the text calls the city Babylon. Thus it seems Babylon was seen as the new Eridu, and Eridu was seen as the ancient version of Babylon. So the Babel of Genesis 11 is probably a reference to Eridu, not the later New Babylon, established in the 2nd millennium BC, after the decline of Eridu had already happened. So if we're going to look for the Tower of Babel in the 4th millennium BC, Eridu is the most likely place, and the ziggurat constructed there is the most likely candidate. Now Genesis 11 says that after they built the ziggurat, God came down and confused their languages, and they left from building the city. Now Eridu was abandoned several times, and finally abandoned for good in 600 BC. One important abandonment did happen in the 4th millennium BC, after the construction of a ziggurat, referred to as Temple 1. Fuad Safar excavated Eridu and found evidence of occupations there going back thousands of years. The oldest temple may be as old as the city itself, and over time, larger structures were built on top, expanding the size of the site. The final temple was constructed in the Uruk period, or 4th millennium BC, and referred to as Temple 1 and Temple 2. However, after this, the city was suddenly and abruptly abandoned and was never restored to its former glory. Gwendolyn Leake says, almost overnight, Eridu was completely abandoned, quickly buried under enormous drifts of sand that filled the deserted buildings, with only the main mound left standing. The temple itself was rebuilt twice in the Proto-Literate period, like an island in the desert, but the accumulation of loose sand seems to have made the area surrounding the main mound uninhabitable. When after some centuries, the area was once more habited, the population chose another spot, about 1 kilometer to the north, and few efforts were made to rebuild the shrine on the main mound. The site only became important again in the early dynastic II period. In other words, the city of Eridu was abandoned during the Uruk period, even though the cultic site was still in use after. Another archaeological survey by Henry Wright records that the later periods after the Uruk period show little evidence of occupation. It is unfortunate that the Jemdet Nasar and early dynastic III complexes are indicated primarily by the absence of things, for it is difficult to establish their presence unless they form the dominant complex on a site. Fuad Safar agrees. This was the situation at Eridu during the first half of the Uruk period, which appears to have been brought to a conclusion by no less an event than the total abandonment of the site. In other words, the archaeological data suggests Eridu was suddenly abandoned during the time period of Temple I, and the ziggurat structure was only fully restored later during the Ur-III dynasty. The evidence shows the combinations of Temple I and Temple II created a massive structure in the center of Eridu, dedicated to the god Enki, also called Ea. Safar also notes there is evidence the structure was built with baked bricks. Then, the evidence suggests during the 4th millennium BC, or the Uruk period, Eridu was suddenly abandoned, leaving this massive ziggurat complex behind. Then what we see is that later kings during the Ur-III dynasty rebuilt over this ziggurat and added to the overall complex. Now if you do your research, you will find that Safar notes the temple and the ziggurat complex that was at Eridu was not abandoned as long as the city was. In other words, we have evidence the ziggurat complex was utilized after the city was abandoned at various times, later in the Proto-Literate period, up until the time of the 3rd Ur dynasty, when Amarsin restored it. But this seems to be what Genesis 11 says. Genesis says they left off from building the city, not necessarily the ziggurat itself. In verse 5, Genesis notes that God came down after the ziggurat was already built, and then they were dispersed, and they stopped building the city and abandoned it. It doesn't say the Tower of Babel was never completed. In the archaeological record, for some odd reason, the city of Eridu was abandoned, even though the ziggurat complex was still in use by a small northern settlement. Then, the Ur-III dynasty later came in and restored the ziggurat and temple because the whole complex fell into ruin. Leek notes the city itself was only treated as a cultic site from here on out. It was never seen as a fully fledged city again. Religious and economic centers slowly were moved to other cities, like Babylon or the city of Ur. In other words, Eridu was habited, but only for religious reasons, until it was fully abandoned during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And it was never fully restored to its former greatness, like it was in the Proto-Literate period. On top of this, even though the ziggurat complex was still in use later during the Proto-Literate period, Safar does note that the ziggurat complex did fall into ruin because it was temporarily abandoned for a shorter time when the city itself was abandoned. So basically, the evidence suggests that when the city was suddenly left abandoned during the Uruk period, the ziggurat complex itself was also abandoned temporarily, but a northern settlement began to utilize it again and repave some parts. Then, the 3rd dynasty of Ur fully restored the ziggurat complex and built on top of it. But all this seems to be a pretty strong correlation to what Genesis 11 records happened. An older city, also known as Babel, constructed a massive ziggurat from fired bricks, and then the site was suddenly abandoned and was never restored to its former glory, even though a later new city of Babel was established at a different location. Now, correlations alone do not prove the event recorded in Genesis 11 happened. However, it also cannot be presupposed the Tower of Babel was just a mythic invention meant to attack Babylon during the Jewish exile. The text of Genesis 11 is written in a way that is describing a real event in the past. It could have been used in a way to attack the later empire of Babylon, but the authors seem to be using an historical event in the past, not inventing a legend whole cloth. And given the archaeological data, it very well could have happened during the Uruk period, which the later city of Babylon claims to have descended from. So despite the critics, we do have good evidence the Tower of Babel's story could have been a real historical event that took place in the Proto-Literate period. Last, what about the languages being confused? Well, this would be hard to prove archaeologically speaking, since it happened at a time before written records. Some have told me privately that because Sumerian isn't related to other languages, living or dead, it could have been a result of the languages being confused by God. Now, I guess this is possible, but as of now, I'm not willing to take this route. The text of Genesis 11 says they dispersed from the region and moved out, so each group is probably untraceable and would have blended in with whatever culture they assimilated into. The only other text that might hint to this event is the Sumerian epic called Ennemerkar in the Lord of Arata. Some scholars believe this text is talking about a future event when everyone will worship Enlil with one tongue. But Samuel Noah Kramer believed this text was referring to a time in the past when all the people worshipped Enlil with one tongue until his rival, the god Enki, came down and confused the languages. Enki was the patron deity of Eridu, which is referred to in the text. It also speaks of Ennemerkar wanting to build the massive ziggurat at Eridu, and that it will be a holy mountain and an abode for the gods. So the text does make reference to Eridu, but this is all contingent on the idea that Kramer's translation is the correct one, which we have to acknowledge is disputed. However, even without this, we still do have good evidence the event described in Genesis 11 was describing a real historical event that seems to have happened at Old Babel, or Eridu, the city of Enki. New people migrated into the area, built a large ziggurat complex that utilized fired bricks. Then the city was suddenly abandoned, and a Sumerian epic might allude to Enki confusing the languages. Thus, given the data, the Tower of Babel incident, as recorded in Genesis, correlates well with an event that happened in Mesopotamia's past.